The light that greeted them was wrong. Mara noticed it first. The station Vela 9's approach beacons pulsed slightly out of sequence, a half-beat slow, like something breathing. She said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that the things you name become the things you have to deal with, and she wasn't ready to deal with anything yet. She just pulled the docking yoke a little tighter and set the Karev down between the cradles with a whisper of reverse thrust. 12 years, said Commander Vasil, from the co-pilot seat beside her. His voice was neutral, which meant he was working very hard to keep it that way. Doesn't look like 12 years. No, said Mara. It doesn't. She meant that the station looked good for 12 years abandoned. But she also meant the other thing, that it looked exactly as she remembered it. Down to the amber tint on the observation panels. Down to the dark smear on docking cradle 7, that had always looked like a hand reaching down from the ceiling. She had spent a great deal of effort in the years between trying to make her memory of this place imprecise. Apparently, it had declined to cooperate. Behind them in the main cabin, she could hear the others unbuckling. Dr. Fen Okwu, their medic and the expedition's official psychologist, going through her gear with characteristic efficiency. Sergeant Brecht, ex-Frontier Corps, now technically security consultant, checking the action on his pulse carbine for the 4th time since departure, and Piotr. Piotr was 8 years old and the reason Mara was here at all. He was the only survivor of the Kellerman colony ship that had been found drifting near Vela 9's orbital approach 5 months ago. 41 colonists dead in their bunks of what the coroner's report euphemistically called neurological cascade failure. Piotr had been found seated in the mess hall, eating a protein bar, apparently unaware that anything was wrong. He had not spoken since, he had not cried. He had eaten his protein bar, accepted water when offered, allowed himself to be guided onto the rescue ship without resistance, and then sat very quietly for the entire journey home while the rescue crew filed reports around him and tried not to look at his eyes. Mara had been appointed his caseworker. That was how the Colonial Resettlement Authority phrased it, his caseworker, as if he were a bureaucratic problem to be managed. She had sat with him for 2 weeks in the observation ward at Kepler Station, and she had come to understand 3 things. First, that he was not a problem to be managed. He was a boy who had survived something that no person should survive. Second, that whatever he had survived had left something in him that the doctors couldn't find with their scanners, but that she could feel, when she sat too close to him, a pressure behind the eyes, a low harmonic in the back teeth. Third, that he had, on 2 separate occasions while apparently sleeping, wisped phrases in a language no linguist at Kepler Station could identify, and that those phrases had subsequently been matched by the xenolinguistics team to contact fragmentary transmissions recorded from the Vela system in the years before Station 9 went dark, which was why the Colonial Authority had decided that the best course of action was to bring an 8-year-old boy, who couldn't speak back to the place where 41 people had died, accompanied by a navigator who had been the last human being to leave Vela 9 alive. Mara thought about that as she ran the shutdown sequence. She thought about it very carefully, the way you think carefully about things, when you are trying very hard not to feel them. The airlock cycled with a sound like a long exhale. The station's internal gravity was still functioning. That was the first surprise. Vasil checked his readout and said nothing, which Mara had learned to read as his version of unease. The lights were at half power, amber and deep, every corridor a kind of slow-burning gold. The air recyclers were running. The temperature was 19 degrees Celsius, which was 2 degrees warmer than standard operating protocol. Someone set the thermostat, Brecht said. Residual automation, said Dr. Okwu. The station's VA would maintain basic life support indefinitely on emergency power. The emergency power cells have a rated lifespan of 6 years. Rated, said Okwu. They moved through the docking ring in a tight group, Brecht at the front, Mara at the rear with Piotr's hand in hers. The boy walked easily. No hesitation at the threshold, no flinching at the amber dark. He walked like he knew the way. Mara told herself he didn't. The main habitat ring was intact. Their quarters were as she remembered them. She had requisitioned the same assignment without realizing it, only noticing when she was already unpacking that the sightlines from this window matched the ones from her memory. The orbital curve of the gas giant that Vela 9 orbited. The ring system cutting a pale diagonal. She had stood here before and watched it, and thought she was the luckiest person alive to work somewhere this beautiful. She unpacked her duffel. At the bottom of it, beneath her spare thermals and her navigation tablet, and the small framed photograph of her mother, that she had carried on every posting for 15 years, was a specimen case. She had not packed it herself. It had been there when she opened the duffel on the Karev, somewhere between Kepler and Vela, and she had been so startled that she had closed the case immediately and put the duffel under her bunk and said nothing to anyone. The case was roughly 30 centimeters long. Inside it, preserved in a suspension gel that Colonial Sciences used for xenobiological samples, was a hand. Not a human hand. 3 fingers, triple-jointed, each one ending in a flat sensory pad rather than a nail. The coloration was a deep, dried violet, almost black at the joints. The wrist, if you could call it that, terminated in a ragged cut, not a surgical excision. She knew this hand. She had seen it before. She had been the one to put it in its first container 12 years ago, working by emergency light in a room she tried very hard not to remember. She did not know who had put it in her duffel. She suspected it didn't matter. She set the case on the shelf above her bunk, facing the wall, and went to find the others. She found Pyotr in the station's cartography suite. He was standing in front of the main display, which should have been dark. The station's VI managed power conservation carefully, and non-essential systems were on standby, but which was fully active. The navigational charts rotating slowly in the holographic workspace, the entire local stellar neighborhood laid out in quiet blue light. He was not touching the console. He was standing about a meter back from it, his hands at his sides, watching the charts rotate. As Mara watched from the doorway, one of the charts stopped rotating. A trajectory line extended from Vela 9 outward, curving past the system's edge, reaching toward a region of space that the Colonial Cartographic Standard labeled simply surveyed no assets. The trajectory pulsed once, twice. Then Pyotr turned and looked at her. His expression was entirely his own. That was the thing she kept coming back to. The thing that made it harder than it would have been if his expression had been blank or alien. His expression was that of a small, serious, tired boy who was carrying something very heavy and did not know how to put it down. She crossed the room and crouched beside him so their eyes were level. "Do you know what that is?" she asked, nodding at the display. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the display. Then he looked at her again and shook his head. Very slowly, once. She believed him. She wasn't sure why. She believed him anyway. She took his hand again, and they walked back toward the habitat ring, and she did not look back at the cartography display, which continued to pulse softly behind them, the trajectory line reaching and reaching into empty space. That night she dreamed of needles. Not medical needles, longer. The kind used in industrial splice work. The wide-bore injectors they used in the early days of station construction to bond structural polymer through a subject's bloodstream to harden load-bearing points. She had seen them used on injured engineers twice in her career, both times in emergencies when conventional methods weren't available. Both times the engineer had screamed. In the dream someone was holding her arm. She couldn't see their face. She could hear a voice, low, modulated, with the particular resonance that she associated with the Vela 9 contact files. The recordings made before everything went wrong, the translated fragments. The voice said something she could not quite hear, woke with a single image clear and hard in her mind. A box cutter, the kind carried in every station's maintenance kit, blue handle, blade extended to the second stop. She lay in the amber dark for a long time without moving. Then she got up, went to the shelf above her bunk, and turned the specimen case around so it faced the room. The alien hand was oriented differently than she had left it. The flat sensory pads of its fingers were pointing toward her. She turned it back to face the wall. She did not sleep again. "Tell me something," said Vasil at breakfast. He was looking at his coffee rather than at her. "Something about what?" "About why you're here, the real reason." He looked up then. He had the kind of face that gave very little away. Years of command had carved it that way. But she could read the muscle at the corner of his jaw. "The authority told me they chose you because of your navigational familiarity with the system. Your previous posting here." "That's accurate, Mara." She drank her coffee. "What do you want me to say, Vasil?" "I want you to say what you know. About the station, about what happened before." He set his mug down carefully. "Because I've been reading the incident report from 12 years ago, and it has a quality that incident reports should not have, which is that it leaves me with more questions than I started with. Incident reports do that sometimes. Not to me. I've written 46 of them." He held her gaze. The contact event, the xenolinguistics team, the 6 researchers who went into the lower habitat to establish communication, the power failure, the evacuation, a pause. "You were the last one off the station. The report says you secured the lower habitat, before evacuating, section by section. Alone, that's correct. It also says the lower habitat was found sealed on subsequent survey, atmospheric seal, not emergency seal. The kind of seal you do when you're intending to maintain atmosphere behind the barrier. His voice was very even. That's the kind of seal you do when you're preserving something. The coffee was too hot. She held it anyway. I followed protocol, she said. Mara. She looked at him across the table. Outside the viewport, the gas giant turned slowly in its own silence, patient as geology, indifferent as a god. In the corridor behind them, she could hear the soft sound of Piotr moving through the habitat ring. The same unhurried pace he had maintained since they arrived, moving through this station as if he were reading a map that existed inside his own body. I followed protocol, she said again. Vasil said nothing. He picked up his mug and finished his coffee and left the table. She sat alone with the gas giant and thought about what she was going to do. She found the hand pointing at her again that evening. She had been careful this time. She had turned the case to face the wall, made note of the exact angle, and set a small piece of adhesive tape across the case's base as a tamper indicator. The tape was unbroken. The case had not been moved. The hand was pointing at the door. She understood what this meant clinically. The suspension gel could shift over time under thermal variance. The gel could rotate the hand's orientation through simple fluid dynamics. This was the rational explanation, and it was correct. And she spent about 4 minutes believing it before she stopped. She sat on the edge of her bunk and looked at the hand. It was smaller than she remembered. Everything was smaller than she remembered, the way places always were when you came back. The station that had been vast and labyrinthine in her memory was just a station, properly sized, properly proportioned, smelling of recycled air and machine oil, and the particular sweetness of hydroponic nutrients that all colonial authority installations shared. The monster that had lived here was dead. She had killed it. She had been decorated for it, a commendation written by people who hadn't been there, and so described things in terms that sounded like courage rather than desperation. She had not told anyone about the box cutter, about the sound, about the way Carlo had looked at her, in the last seconds with his own face. Carlo had been the xenolinguistics lead. Carlo had been the one who had pushed the hardest for active communication, who had believed with a conviction that Mara had found charming, and Vasil had found reckless that the alien intelligences in Vela 9's lower depths were benign, were seeking contact, were frightened. He had been right that they were seeking contact. He had been wrong about what kind. They had used him as a bridge. That was the word the debrief psychologist had used, once Mara's treatment had progressed far enough for formal assessment. A neurological bridge. The alien collective was not corporeal in any sense the colonial authorities' xenobiology teams had anticipated. Not the ship, not the artifact, but a psionic distributed network that required a biological host to anchor itself in physical space. Carlo had been a willing host at first. He had been very willing. He had smiled at Mara through a face that was still his and told her it was beautiful. It was all so beautiful she had no idea. Then he had smiled at her through a face that was still his and reached for the injector on the lab table. And she had understood that what was left of Carlo had stopped being the one doing the reaching. She had still hesitated. That was the part she had not put in the report. She had stood in that room, and she had hesitated for what felt like a very long time, while something wearing Carlo's face crossed the distance between them, with Carlo's hands extended toward her. Then she had picked up the box cutter from the lab table. And she had done what had to be done, and she had stood in that room until she stopped shaking, and then she had sealed the room and walked to the docking bay and flown away. She had told the authority that the contact event had been a breach failure, that the xenolinguistics team had been lost in the atmospheric collapse of the lower habitat, which was technically accurate in the sense that the lower habitat had subsequently lost atmosphere. After she had sealed it, deliberately, to make sure nothing got out. She had not told them about Carlo. She had not told them about the hand she had taken. She looked at the hand now in its case on her shelf. "I know you're not him," she said. The hand did not move. "I know," she said. "That's not what this is." She got up, took the case down from the shelf, and locked it in her mission kit under the bunk. Then she went to find Piotr. He was in the lower habitat. She didn't know how he had gotten through the seals. The seals she had placed 12 years ago had been correctly maintained by the station's VI, logged as intact on every survey. She had checked them herself on the first day, her hands very steady and her breathing very controlled, and they had been intact. Now the access corridor was open, the atmospheric barrier deactivated. the inner door standing wide. The lights in the lower habitat were on. Mara stood at the threshold for a moment. She could hear, from somewhere further in, the sound of Piotr's voice. Not speaking, not quite. The sound he was making was more tonal than speech. Rhythmic, almost melodic. The kind of sound a child makes when they are singing to themselves without words. She went in. The lower habitat was smaller than her memory of it too. The lab benches were still in place. The equipment was still secured. The specimen lockers that had held the first material recovered from the alien structure. Fragments of what appeared to be computational substrate, analyzed and cataloged, and eventually identified as components of the distributed network's physical anchor points, were still sealed. One of them, she noticed, had been recently unsealed. The locking mechanism's indicator light was amber rather than green. Piotr was in the center of the room. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor with his back to her, and in front of him, arranged with a care that spoke of intention, were the navigational charts he had apparently pulled from the cartography suite's portable archives. Actual physical printouts, which the station maintained for emergency use, rolled and stacked, and now unrolled across the floor in a careful spiral pattern. At the center of the spiral was the trajectory line she had seen on the holographic display, rendered now in pencil on the margin of one of the charts, extending from a point labeled Vela 9 Station to a point that had no label. He was humming to himself. The tune was one she didn't recognize, and then, horribly, was one she did. Not a human tune, not a melody, but the specific harmonic interval the debrief transcripts had described as the alien network's signature frequency. The interval that colonial sciences had been unable to replicate artificially. The interval that was, according to the xenolinguistics team's final report, closer to an emotional state than a communication. She sat down beside him. Not behind him, not at a safe distance. Beside him. After a moment he stopped humming. He looked at the charts. Then he picked up the pencil and added a small mark to the trajectory line. A way, point, a pause. The kind of mark a navigator makes when they want to note a position of interest. Then he held the pencil out to her. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she took it. She found Vasil in the lower habitat storage corridor at 0300, and she knew before she reached him what she would find. She had heard the impact. A single hard blow, repeated. The rhythm of a person working through something that doesn't want to give. She had come down with her torch and her carbine, Brecht's spare, signed out from the armory on grounds of night security protocol, and she had followed the sound to the section of corridor she had sealed with particular care, the room she had locked behind her 12 years ago and not opened since. Vasil had a plasma cutter. He was working on the secondary seal, the one she had welded manually, in addition to the atmospheric barrier, because she had wanted to be thorough. He had gotten through most of it. As she rounded the corner, the last section gave way and the wall section shifted. Behind it was a room. Inside the room was what she had left. She did not look at it directly. She looked at Vasil. He turned when he heard her. His face was doing something complicated that she had never seen it do before, which was that it was trying to be kind. A man who had spent decades building his face into an administrative instrument was now using it very badly for an entirely different purpose. And the result was a specific form of painful to witness. "I should have told you I was going to do this," he said. "Why didn't you?" "Because I thought," he stopped, reconsidered. "I thought if I asked you first you'd stop me, I would have." "I know." He looked at what was behind the wall. Then he looked back at her. "Mara, I've known for a long time, not everything, but enough." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm the one who processed your departure clearance that day, 12 years ago. You were the last off the station, and you were carrying a specimen case and you hadn't logged it in the departure manifest. I flagged it for review, and then I removed the flag because," he breathed, "because you came through that airlock looking like a person who had just survived something very specific and very terrible, and I thought the most important thing was to get you home." She said nothing. "I've been covering it since then. Not actively, passively, not asking questions, approving reports without reading the sections I didn't want to read." He held her gaze. "I told myself I was protecting you." "Were you?" He was quiet for a long time. "I was protecting myself from knowing," he said. "From having to decide what to do if I knew." She looked at him. This man who had been her commanding officer, and then her advocate, and then her recommender, and then the person who had nominated her for this mission, because he needed someone who'd not flinch at Vela 9, and had told himself that person was her. This man who had built his own containment, around his own unanswered questions, and maintained it for 12 years through sheer professional discipline. "What are you going to do now?" she said. He looked back at the wall at what was behind it. He stopped. "I had a plan. For Carlo's remains, a formal recovery, a proper record, set things right. That's what I told myself." He set the plasma cutter down on the corridor floor. "But I've been standing here for about 20 minutes, and I keep not being able to start. So I think the plan may not have been as solid as it seemed when I made it." She moved past him. She looked at what was behind the wall. She had not done this in 12 years. She looked at it with the steady, controlled attention she gave to pre-flight checklists and damage assessments and every other thing she had trained herself to see clearly regardless of how she felt about seeing it. Then she looked at Vasile. "There's something you don't know," she said. "Something I should have told the authority 12 years ago." He waited. She told him about Carlo, about the bridge, about what had been using his hands when she made the choice she made. She told him about the humming, the harmonic interval, the thing she recognized in it that she hadn't admitted to herself until she sat on the floor of the lower habitat next to Piotr, and he had held out a pencil and she understood that what he was offering her was not a trap but an invitation. When she finished, Vasile sat down on the corridor floor. He sat there for a moment with his hands on his knees like a man who has discovered that the ground is not where he thought it was. He knew what he was agreeing to, Mara said. Toward the end, some part of him did. He was still in there. She heard her own voice doing the thing it did when she talked about things she hadn't talked about for a long time. She let it. He kept using the word beautiful, over and over. Even at the end, whatever they showed him, whatever it felt like from inside, she stopped. He didn't fight it. Right at the end, I think he chose it. "That doesn't change what you did. No. Or what you had to do." She looked at him. He looked back at her, and for the first time in all the years she had known him, she had the impression that she was seeing him without the administrative surface. Just a man. Just a person who had spent a long time building elaborate structures around something he didn't want to know, and who was now sitting on a floor, in the dark, looking at what was left, when you took the structures away. "What do we do?" he said. She thought about Piotr, sitting in the lower habitat with his charts and his humming. His pencil held out toward her in an offer she hadn't understood until she had accepted it. She thought about the trajectory line, the waypoint, the patient pointing of the hand in its case. "We do what we came here to do," she said. "We figure out what it is that Piotr is carrying, what it wants to show us. And if it wants to show us something we don't want to see." She thought about Carlo's face, in that last moment, before she had done what she did. The expression on it. The expression she had worked very hard for 12 years to classify as alien, as other, as something that happened to a face rather than something a person chose to show. "Beautiful," he had said. She had never let herself consider whether he was right. "Then we see it," she said. She went to get the specimen case. She brought it back to the lower habitat and set it on one of the lab benches and opened it. The alien hand sat in its suspension gel, its flat sensory pads inert, its triple-jointed fingers slightly curled. In the low amber light it looked like something sleeping. Piotr was there. He watched her open the case with the same serious attention he gave everything. He did not seem surprised. She looked at him. "Is this yours?" she said. He looked at the hand, then he looked at her. Then he shook his head. "Is it theirs?" He considered this more carefully. Then he nodded, once but with a quality she could only read as qualified, as if to say, not exactly but close enough. "What do they want?" He picked up the pencil from the floor where he had left it. He crossed to the nearest lab bench and pulled a sheet of chart paper from the emergency archive stack. He drew the trajectory line again, the waypoint, the unlabeled destination. Then he looked at her and held the pencil out again. She took it. She looked at the chart. She looked at the trajectory and the waypoint and the blank space beyond it. And she took the pencil and wrote, at the destination, a single word that came to her from the xenolinguistics files. From the translated fragments, from the one phrase that had appeared consistently across every recovered transmission from the alien network in the years before the contact event. The word was again. Piotr read what she had written. And then, for the first time since anyone had found him sitting in the mess hall of the Kellerman, for the first time in 5 months of silence, the boy smiled. The debrief team arrived from Kepler Station 18 days later. In those 18 days they had done their work. Vasile had prepared a formal recovery record for Carlo, thorough and precise, written in the plain language of a man who had stopped needing his reports to protect him, Doctor. Ok Wu had documented Piotr's communication progress with the systematic attention of a scientist who understood she was looking at something that did not fit any existing category and who was taking her time with it anyway, because some things should not be hurried. Brecht had twice performed security sweeps of the lower habitat, and on the second sweep had stood for a long time in front of the trajectory art still spread on the floor, and then asked Mara, with careful casualness, what the word at the end of the line meant, and she had told him, and he had nodded as if she had confirmed something he already suspected. Mara had written her own report. She had written it from the beginning, without ellipses, without careful omissions. She had written about Carlo, and about the box cutter, and about what she had understood in his final expression, and what she had refused, for 12 years, to allow herself to understand. She had written about the hand in the specimen case, and about the cartography suite, and about Piotr's pencil. She had written about the harmonic interval, and about sitting on the floor of the lower habitat and hearing it and recognizing that it was not a trap, had never been a trap, was something older and stranger, and more patient than anything she had category for. She had written at the end of the report that she believed the alien network had not been trying to invade. She believed it had been trying to find something. She believed it had found it in Carlo briefly and lost it in the chaos of the contact event, and had spent 12 years leaving traces. Breadcrumbs, really, not threats, for whoever came back. For her specifically, as the one who had been in the room and had survived, and had left carrying something that belonged to the network, and had not, ultimately, been able to stop herself returning. She did not claim to know what it wanted to show them at the end of the trajectory line. She said she thought they should go and see. On the last morning before the debrief team's arrival, she sat at the observation window in her quarters and watched the gas giant turn. The ring system cut its pale diagonal across the dark. She had watched this same view 12 years ago and called it beauty. And then she had spent 12 years trying to make it only a memory. Behind her, on the lab bench where she had moved it, the specimen case was open. She had decided at some point in the 18 days to stop turning it to face the wall. She wasn't sure exactly when she had decided this. She thought it had been when she understood that it was not an accusation. It had never been an accusation. It was pointing at her the way you point at someone you are trying to find. She heard the door. Piotr came and stood beside her at the window. He was wearing the gray station issue coveralls they had found in his size in the equipment stores, and he had found somewhere a length of red cord that he had tied around his wrist, and he looked in that moment entirely and specifically himself. A child who had lost everything and survived it, and was carrying something immense, and was, nevertheless, still a child, still present, still here. She put her arm around his shoulders. They watched the ring system in the amber light. Outside, the network waited with the patience of something that had always known they would come back. The trajectory line waited on its chart on the lab bench. The waypoint waited in the dark between stars. In the backyard of the observable universe, an 8-year-old boy leaned against a navigator's arm and watched the slow turning of a gas giant's rings. And somewhere in the warm hum of the station's life support, something ancient and patient and very far from home made a sound that was not quite music, the same interval it had been making for 12 years, which meant something like, "There you are," which meant something like, "We found you," which meant, if you listened in exactly the right way, from exactly the right angle, if you had stopped running from it and turned around to face it at last, beautiful.